Ready? 3, 2, 1. Gorgeous.
How's that iPhone footage?
In this video, I'm going to take you behind the scenes of how I script, plan, shoot, edit, and color grade a car commercial shot 100% on the iPhone 15 Pro. This project kicked off when Sandmark reached out to me asking if I can shoot a video with their lenses. Knowing how capable the iPhone 15 Pro is, especially after they introduced Apple Log and having an entire Apple event shot on iPhone, I accepted the challenge. To bring this vision to life, I reached out to my buddy Herman to help with the behind the scenes and Kevin to be our driver. One of the most important piece of gear when shooting on an iPhone or any camera are ND filters. They allow you to control the exposure and dial in your settings in order to get the perfect motion blur. The second piece of gear is a gimbal for those smooth shots. While the iPhone has amazing stabilization built in, I found that the gimbal brings in that professional level of stabilization. The three lenses I used were the 2x telephoto lens, the 6x telephoto lens, and the macro lens from Sandmark. I'll talk more about which lens I used later when we break down the shots. For the car rig, I used a combination of equipment. This includes 2 Ulanzi suction cups, a Mic Visuals tracking POV kit, and a magic arm. It's a pretty jank setup, and it only works if the roads are smooth enough, and that's because it's missing a Z-axis stabilization. The final piece of gear are these wireless headphones. Now, don't skip this because it's not as fancy or as cool as the rest of the gear, because this ended up saving a lot of time on set and made things a lot safer while shooting. Communication can easily be overlooked in shoots. When filming from one car to another, it's crucial to maintain communication between the camera car driver and the subject car driver. In a previous Bronco spec ad, we tried using walkie-talkies, but the connection kept dropping, or they straight up didn't work. We ended up using hand gestures and yelling, which really made things difficult, especially if you're holding a gimbal with one hand out of a car and when you're trying to tell the drivers to switch lanes, speed up, or slow down. To solve this issue, Synco reached out asking if I was interested in their X-Talk X5 headsets. Disclaimer, they did send out this product for me to review and to keep, but I'm not getting paid, nor do they get to see this video before its release. It comes with 5 headsets and a case. There's a master headset, which is what you use to connect to the other 4. You can set up any of the 5 to be the master headset if you were to ever lose it. The master headset acts as like a tower, so the 350-meter distance of connection is from the master headset, and you can connect up to 18 headsets in total.
Now, these headsets worked really well. I was able to effectively communicate to both drivers without having to occupy my hands with walkie-talkies or doing hand gestures. These headsets are super lightweight, and I had no issues wearing them all day. They're rated to have a battery life of up to 24 hours, and I didn't even have to think about the battery throughout the entire day, leaving them on for the entire shoot. To turn on the mic, you just bring down the mic, and to mute yourself, you just lift it up.
The only 2 times the mic connection dropped was when the Corvette drove off really far and the headset was inside the car. And the other time was when I was filming in the woods, like 100 meters away without a clear line of sight, while the headset was in the car. And I could still communicate with the driver. It was just a bit spotty. Overall, these guys really made communicating easier, and you also look very professional. Moving forward, I'm definitely going to be using these on all my shoots. In order to get the most out of the iPhone, you need to have the correct settings. Don't use the stock iPhone app. I use the Blackmagic camera app, and it allows me to have full manual control over the camera settings. This is why I mentioned earlier that one of the most important gear is having that ND filter in order to achieve the correct settings, which in turn gets that smooth motion blur. I shot in 30 FPS instead of 24. I find that iPhone footage shot at 24 FPS seems very choppy. It might be due to the low bitrate. For shutter speed, follow the 180-degree rule, so double whatever your frame rate is at. 30 FPS would be 1/60, 24 FPS would be 1/50. For the ISO, always try to keep that as low as possible. I did pretty much all of the filming in autofocus except for the shot through the trees because I didn't want the focus to hunt as there's a lot of trees in the foreground. For the codec, I did Apple ProRes 422HQ in 4K. The color space was Apple Log HDR, and I didn't bother recording directly to an SSD because it would be too cumbersome to build out the iPhone. I wanted to be nimble when switching between the gimbal and tripod. When the iPhone storage was almost full, I just offloaded to an SSD. My biggest tip I can tell you is do not clip your highlights. Learn how to read a histogram. If there's a sharp line leaning towards the right, it is clipping. I like to expose the camera just before there's any clipping in the highlights so I can retain as much detail in the shadows. Now the caveat would be if I'm shooting and the sun is between the trees in the background. In that case, of course, I'm not going to try to expose for the really bright parts like the sun. And typically it's just a very small amount that is overexposed. In that case, you definitely want to maintain more shadow details. I do want to mention, if you're not using an iPhone 15 Pro or newer and it doesn't have Apple Log, you're not going to get the best image as you're seeing here because on older iPhones, Apple baked in their post-processing into the image, so like sharpening. Now, that's not to say you can't get good footage. Make sure you still apply the correct settings. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me on Instagram or drop a comment down below.
Stop it.
Free Corvette, bro. I'm going crazy, bro. I need it. I need it, bro. I need it so bad.
As for planning, I use Milanote. They're not a sponsor. I pay for it myself. Milanote is great when it comes to visualizing and organizing ideas. I didn't go too in depth when it came to planning this video. I had a shot list of every shot I wanted, and I knew what I needed to make a sequence. Before I even get to planning, I like to have the music already selected. This allows me to visualize in my head what shots needed to be in place in those moments. The music is from Artlist.io. They are also not a sponsor, but I find that they have a pretty solid music collection and they're not too expensive. I also quickly drew some diagrams of the car positioning. Now, it seems dumb, but when it comes to safety, you need to ensure that both the driver car and the subject car understands what movement you're asking them to do. You don't want to risk anyone's safety. Let's start with the macro shots. These are the quick whip pans that adds a burst of energy between cuts. For these, I use the Sandmark macro lens. It allows the camera to be up close and capture a lot of detail. Now, to be honest, if you go to the ultra wide camera, it can also produce macro shots as well. The reason why you'd use a macro lens is because it allows you to use the main sensor, which results in better quality. When you're trying to find these details, focus on patterns. The more patterns, the better. These are very quick shots and you don't need a very long clip. A quick tip is to use a finger to help glide across the surface. I found that it helps maintain a fixed distance and removes any micro jitters. For interior shots, I focused on capturing details like the gauge cluster, button clicks, and the accelerator. For these, I only used the ND filter. For the gauge cluster shot, I didn't do the rotation in camera. I just held the iPhone as steady as possible, and in post I added some rotation keyframes to spin it. The way we lit the accelerator shot, the car was not moving. We parked the car in a way where a beam of sun would hit the shoe as well as the accelerator, and I used the ultra-wide lens on the iPhone. Add a little bit of handshake, and that's it. In order to achieve this shot, I used Sandmark's 6x telephoto lens. I was actually surprised by how good this lens ended up working for this shot. The iPhone 15 Pro only has a 3x zoom, so you wouldn't be able to achieve nearly as much compression. On the iPhone 15 Pro Max, you do have a 5x zoom, which may work, but remember that using the Sandmark lens, you're able to use the main camera sensor, which allows for better image quality. In order to achieve the smooth panning, I used a video tripod head and I manually focused to approximately where the car would be in focus. Leaving it in manual focus without pulling focus was fine because the distance between the car and the camera are relatively the same. Plus, the iPhone has such a small sensor, it has a deeper depth of field, which makes more of the frame in focus. For these, I used the Ulanzi suction cups. I attached the suction cups to a flat surface, and using a phone mount, I attached the iPhone. I used the ultra-wide lens with the ND filter in order to get more perspective for these shots. Because these are mounted static shots, to add more interest in these shots, try to work with the reflections. You'll notice that I specifically chose locations that would have a lot of trees, and as they fly by, it creates a more dynamic shot. For the roller shots, I built a rig with various components that I mentioned earlier in the gear section. The Mic Visuals Tracking POV kit was used as a base to connect 2 of the Ulanzi suction cups. I'm not guaranteeing that 2 suction cups is enough, but it worked for me. In order to attach the gimbal to the base, I used 3 magic arms, 2 attached to the side and 1 to the bottom. In order to wirelessly control the panning and tilt of the gimbal, you can connect the PS4 controller directly to the DJI RS3 and wirelessly control it. Now, you're probably wondering, how did I monitor the shot when the iPhone is on the outside of the car? This is where things became really jank. I AirPlayed the iPhone directly to my MacBook. Did it work?
Bro, this shit's ass, bro. This is what you get for using AirPlay as your wireless transmission source.
Was the connection smooth? Smooth enough. The connection did become spotty at times, and it did have some struggles connecting to it. What's really funny was the following week, Blackmagic Design drops an update to the Blackmagic camera app with live streaming and manual controls through another iPad or iPhone. This would have saved so much time without having to need to connect to AirPlay and remembering to hit record or adjust camera settings. It all could have been done wirelessly. So you guys won't have any issues going forward. Now, in order to make car rollers more dynamic, remember earlier when I showed those hand-drawn diagrams? You want movement between the cars. Having the cars crossing each other and pulling ahead creates more dynamic shots. Having the subject car speeding in or speeding off also creates more visual interest. Now, when you see these car commercials where the car is speeding, they're not actually speeding. I sped up most of the clips by like around 30%. You don't want to speed up the footage too much or else the shot no longer looks realistic. Another thing to keep in mind that as you speed up the footage, the 100-degree rule for shutter speed is changing. For this shot in the trees, this was actually a very slow shot. After speeding it up, you'll notice that it's lacking motion blur. To fix this, I used DaVinci Resolve's motion blur effects, and I was able to add it back into the shot. Turned out pretty good. Another editing tip is when you have those really fast cuts of like the macro shots, one thing I did to ease the shot when it's cutting to the next scene was to actually grab a macro clip and cut it and change the blending mode so that it actually makes it more transparent. So it's not a hard cut. All right, color grading. Earlier I mentioned why Apolog was a game changer. It allows way more flexibility when it comes to color grading, and it removes the baked-in processing that all the older iPhones have. Now, the first thing I do is use the Apple Rec 709 LUT. On a new node, I apply a color space transform and set the output gamma to Cineon Film Log. Under LUT, Film Looks, I select the Kodak 2383D55. Now, I like to create a node in the first position where I would use the HDR wheels to adjust my exposure, and in the primaries, I'll adjust the white balance and tint. The reason why you want to do this before the Rec 709 LUT is because the data hasn't been compressed into the Rec 709 color space, whereas if you applied the white balance and tint changes afterwards, you're working with less colors. Now, I create another node where I do a simple S-curve, bringing the contrast levels to where I like them. I drag this bottom point over to where you see the data in the shadows. This just ensures that the blacks on the screen are actually black. I find it gives it that extra pop in contrast. The final node is where I would do some minor adjustments. For example, if I find that the road is a bit too blue, I would just go into the hue versus sat and just bring it down a bit. And that's pretty much how I shot this car commercial using the iPhone 15 Pro. If you find these breakdowns helpful, let me know in the comments down below. If you have any more questions that I didn't cover, comment or message me over on Instagram. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.